This is the market and the transformation that in rising above the numbers, the Caribbean will need to adapt to. In the last 6 years, I've reviewed, I've visited, and I've evaluated over 300 travel companies and dozens of destinations engaged in sustainable tourism practices around the globe. And it boils down to this. We are in a significant market paradigm shift. We're embracing sustainable tourism standards, such as what we talked about just a little while ago, is not just a question of ethics, doing what's good for the planet, doing what's good for citizenship, but it's increasingly doing what's right for business growth. And in that context, governments and destinations that want to stay ahead of this curve are going to increasingly need to look at their investment portfolios and say, you know, how can we attract the kind of investors that are going to bring us further down the trail of the objectives that we want to see? In the country, the Maldives, which I mentioned to you earlier, has embarked on their own sustainable plan to become the world's first fossil fuel country. They attracted investors that through incentives and, you know, tax credits and other ways that came into the Maldives, developed particularly nice resorts, and have done it on a sustainable model that, in fact, the government is now using as an example of how to chart the country's national development standards. So from the country level, from the destination level, how governments set policies in place to bring in the innovators of sustainability will become very important for how those same countries and destinations will be able to stay ahead of the curve in this changing tourism market that I've mentioned. Now, just to be clear, does what I'm telling you mean that, you know, every or even most tourists out there today care about the environment, that every single one, you know, wants to buy the sustainable hotel, everyone cares about their impacts on the lives of local people? The answer is absolutely not. But the number who do, as I've said, are steadily increasing, and that expanding market niche is simply too big to ignore for any business or any destination. From my own vantage point, the Caribbean is at a historic crossroads. Not because, or not just because, of the global economic recession having dragged on and slowed tourism growth, but because the region represents one of the world's oldest and largest tourism destinations, and because it depends so heavily on tourism for its economic survival. In many respects, the canary in the cave, the proverbial canary in the cave on tourism and its impacts have been two destinations, two regions, the Caribbean and the Mediterranean. For years were the birthplace of mass tourism and drove global tourism numbers. But of course, as we heard earlier, tourism is now expanding itself. And as the tourism market continues to look for these senses of authenticity, destinations that are not spoiled, places that have their culture intact and their environment intact, those destinations are the ones that are going to have to lead this new level of tourism. And in the case of the Caribbean, I can tell you right now, in the Mediterranean, on the coast of Portugal, for example, they are actually tearing down some of their, you know, huge concrete tourism resorts that were built in the 1950s and 60s when this was the heyday of mass tourism. And, you know, those thousands of umbrellas on the beach lined up one after another and that type of thing. And they're trying to recreate what was once there before. Smaller towns and villages, locally owned shops, hotels with, you know, that are run by local families, and new hotels that are following the kind of sustainable principles we were talking about here. It's hard to open a magazine any longer without some aspect, a travel magazine, without some aspect of sustainable tourism not appearing in its pages. And this whole notion of quality, we talk a lot in the Caribbean about quality and standards. And yes, we, you know, continue to need to think about those, you know, service and, you know, quality of guest experience. These are critically important things. But the whole notion of quality and service and standards in the tourism industry is also changing around the equation of sustainability, where a room with a view and great guest services and, wonderfully designed hotels are not just the only standard any longer for quality in the tourism industry. Sustainability and tourism's impact is beginning to be a measure of quality as well. This is something that the Caribbean can get out ahead of, because in 5 more years, it's going to be the rule. At National Geographic, at Condé Nast Traveler, at Travel and Leisure, I can tell you in these magazines now, as they look at best of places, and especially in National Geographic Traveler, when we look at best hotels and best destinations and wonderful resorts and top vacations, tours of a lifetime, all that type of stuff, we're looking at the quality of service. We're looking at the infrastructure capabilities. We're looking at those wonderful things like great food and, wonderful views and all that type of thing. And we're looking at that destination's ability to follow and practice sustainable tourism standards. So this is itself becoming a new quality indicator. If ever there was a time for the Caribbean to continue to embrace and expand on its sustainable tourism efforts, from hotels to convention centers, from business travel to leisure travel, from tour operators and especially to cruise ships, now is that moment to better position the region with a competitive market advantage related to sustainable practices. Because those businesses and destinations that understand sustainable tourism transformation now underway are going to be the businesses and destinations that emerge as the tourism leaders of tomorrow. This also helps explain why some groups like Fortune now hold an annual conference on sustainability and marketplace adaptation in relation to it. And who would have guessed that a hotel group like Marriott, for example, would send their senior executives to testify, which they did incidentally 18 months ago, before the U.S. Senate on the need to protect endangered species and wilderness habitat while expanding their sustainable hotel practices. I mean, think about it for a moment. Marriott hotels, what in the world are senior executives from a hotel group going and testifying on why you need to save the planet? Where did that come from? I thought it's about how do we get more heads in beds? Or, in fact, is the strategy that by testifying in, how we need to protect the planet linked to how we get more heads in beds? 2 years ago, Marriott signed an agreement with the Brazilian government to commit $2 million to protect 1.4 million acres of endangered rainforest in the Amazon as a way to help combat climate change. To be honest with you, I'd like to think that Bill Marriott Jr. woke up one morning and said, my God, I've got 3,000 hotels around the world. We're in 90 countries. I've made a ton of money. I'm older now. You know what? I just want to see what I can do to help save planet Earth. Well, maybe that was in there. But I, again, was curious enough that I tracked him down. And I met him in person. And I asked him, why did you do this? And this is what he said to me. Our market research showed that over 20% of our clients now favor green businesses. And frankly, Marriott is not about to turn its back on 20% of our market, especially when that market seems to be growing.